Welcome to the Alarpa Podcast, the home for cultural chit-chat in and outside Madrid. People will talk. Welcome to Season 5 premiere of the Alarpa Podcast. You cannot find us on HBO. You cannot find us on Showtime. You cannot find us on Amazon. But you can find us here on your God-given, wonderful podcast app. This is the first show of the season, the first show of 2018. And by God, it's the first show of the rest of our lives. How are you?
Very excited.
Any resolutions?
To get to season 100.
Well, we can do that if we make every new episode a new season. So next week we'll be debuting season 6 and then a little bit of a hiatus because Mary here is going to Egypt.
You're obsessed that I'm going to India.
For 3 weeks. So I hope everybody had a wonderful Christmas. I remember doing this after... because last year we went to the Anthropological Museum, and also we went to see photographs of children from the Spanish Civil War and afterwards. You remember that?
I remember.
That was our first podcast of 2017. After a little bit of a hiatus, we've been a lot more consistent this year after that. So that was the start of something beautiful. So today we're going to talk about something similarly literary and arty, and it spans everything from the 6th century, singular, of course, unless you believe in a multi-universe, up until modern times, taking in poets from Michael Hartnett to Seamus Heaney, and even Tennyson and W.H. Auden and beyond that as well. So we're going to be looking at old Irish poems and why they're relevant and why it's interesting in part 2. So of course, yeah, that's pretty much it, isn't it?
I think it is.
I feel like after offering our listeners the drama in the previous podcast of the ticket lady and the parking patroller, we were marooned in your car, that this is too low key of an intro, but here we are sitting on a sofa. Nothing has happened. We've had cups of tea.
We're settling down.
And yeah, old age has been kind to us in some senses, but our life, I feel, is missing something.
What?
Nevertheless, onwards inexorably to part 2. Well, Doctor, do you know what Kieran Carson, Seamus Heaney, Robert Graves, Paul Muldoon, Frank O'Connor, Michael Hartnett, do you know what these guys and girls have in common?
Some prize?
They have translated old Irish poems into modern Irish poems. Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing.
I have to thank my uncle for giving me this book. It is called The Finest Music and Anthology of Early Irish Lyrics, edited by Maurice Rudin, who was kind enough to write around 34 or 35 page introduction explaining what these poems are, where they come from, why they're so interesting, and how the translation worked. So there's a lot of points that we can kind of delve into and discuss. looking at these works. You've had a look through it as well, so you know some things I think that have grabbed your attention. Can you fill us in on what those are?
Well, the first thing that I saw was about the titles, but it says that most poems didn't have titles.
That is true. So yeah, if you read this book, and I do recommend that you get this book, it's published by Faber and Faber, or Faber and Faber, whatever way you want to say it. The Irish Times has called it a terrific new compendium. Okay, so this is the point of the podcast where I'll stop reading things from the book,
Yeah.
and start actually going into some analysis.
When's it from? What year?
Well, technically the poems are from the 6th century upwards.
Well,
but
I know, but
this was first published in 2014. This
Okay,
paperback
so
edition
very
was
recent.
yeah, but this book I'm holding here was published last year in 2017.
No.
And in case you were interested, the typeset was by Refined Catch Limited from Suffolk.
Well,
Did you care about that?
I just wanted to know like how old it was.
Okay.
It's very current.
And if you wanted to know, this book is sold subject to the condition that it shall not, by way of trade or otherwise, be lent, resold, hired, or
shut
otherwise
up.
circulated.
No, I don't think that's
consent
needed.
in any form of binding of cover
No.
other than that in which it is
No.
published and without a similar condition, including this
No.
condition being imposed on a subsequent
No.
purchaser. Okay, that's the end of that. So, actually, on the next page there's In Memory of Seamus Heaney. So
Yeah.
that is nice. That is a nice touch. He did pass away recently, and he was a great man for translating poems and texts from a variety of languages, but of course Irish as well. So, sorry, we digress a little bit. You said that the titles of the poems what grabbed your attention. So can you just take it from there, please?
Well, it's because there's no titles, but the titles have been just given by the translators.
Yeah.
Either from the context or, well, first word of the poem. Or...
Yeah, well, a lot of poems are prosy. They're kind of written in a prose style, and I think it's easy to get the title from the poem because it has a story element to it. A lot of the titles are just kind of functional words, neutral or one word, and it's obviously very related to the poem. Now, you're a little bit of a poet. Now, you don't give any titles to your poems, so I'm just interested.
How do you know that now?
Because I think you might have mentioned it to me once, and definitely you mentioned it to me before we do the podcast. So, why do you never give poems titles?
Well, I just don't feel the need for it because I don't know. I don't want to I don't feel the need to sum up what it is about, and I suppose the title is just a summary of what or a I don't know, like a previous idea that the reader gets before they start reading.
Yeah.
So why? I don't see the need. Why do you give them titles?
Well, sometimes I love the title maybe more than the poem. That doesn't mean to say that the poem is bad. I quite like the poem, but like you said, the title is like a distillation of what the poem is about. So if the title has something in it, it kind of encapsulates what you feel about what you've written, for example. But other times I know myself that the titles I give them are quite arbitrary, and I just put them to put something because you have to. And usually in those situations, I just put a word that could be in the text. That isn't the text, or is kind of non-committal, for example. But then, of course, if you leave your poems untitled, so ironically, untitled could be the title. I don't know. It's kind of pretentious and a bit knobby.
Not to put a title?
No, to put untitled.
To put untitled? Yeah, but that's stupid. That's
Yeah.
just something editors do, no?
Or wankers, I don't know.
It's not mutually exclusive.
A bit of a needle there. So Sigur Rós in one of their albums left the whole album untitled. So it's entitled 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And they invited the listener to give their own titles to the song. Now I love Sigur Rós, but I did have to find a bucket and bob it into it after hearing that. But the album is great to listen to, though. So yeah, the titles are fantastic. So for example, some of the titles here are in Irish as well, which is quite nice because the whole challenge of these poems, as set out by the editor, Mr. Maurice Reardon, is to maintain the Irishness of these poems, and this has different challenges because some of these poems are written in the 6th century, and perhaps, for example, it got lost or fragments of it. So they try to recover it in the 11th century. So, and then we try to recover it from the 11th century version of the poem, for example. So there's two layers of interpretation there, or trying to piece it together, of detective work, and you're trying to keep the voice of that poem alive. And because there were Irish monks who were living in Ireland and writing about Irish nature and Irish myth, keeping the Irishness alive through keeping the essence of the poem alive. But also as well, you've situations where you have to. Well, he goes on to talk about the Gaelic revival and how people wanted to kind of have a unified Irish identity after years of colonization and being dominated by another culture and another country, and how when you translated it, obviously it was going to be into English, but it had to be into an Irish English. It couldn't be too English, which is interesting when you see that like people like W.H. Auden and Robert Graves got in on the act because they weren't like nationalist poets. I mean, W.B. Yeats, for example, is very highfalutin and kind of aloof. You know, I'm not really fond of him, to be honest with you, but at least he was an Irishman as well, who was very invested in the Irish nationalist movement in certain respects, especially mostly in the cultural sense. And we've done a podcast before on translations, and the whole thing of that plays about keeping uh, the integrity of who we are through the language. So we're speaking English, but in an Irish way, for example. So he mentions that in the introduction as well a little bit, and you can see that in the poems as well. They want to keep Ireland alive, and that can mean different things because it's such an abstract concept. But yeah, so that's kind of the big challenge of the poem, and that's why some of the titles are in Irish. Other titles are Advice to Lovers, which is a bit of a weird poem. The King of Connacht, which is fair enough. Rocula, Ata Ben Astir, is it two Irish poems there, two different titles. You've epigrams. The Scribe is one of them. I quite like this one actually. I'll read a little bit of it. The first paragraph is: My wrist is stiff from writing, from keeping the nibs pat true, as the pen's thin beak squirts its jet of beetle bright juice. Um, so, for example, it's just amazing, really, because all these poems are 6th century, 11th century, 10th century, but they're talking about the same stuff that we're talking about. And if you've watched Barton Fink by the Coen Brothers, it's a movie about writer's block. It's a movie about the process, for example. And this is a poem about the process, about like struggling to get something out. And then in the last verse, he says, and I assume all these poems are out of copyright because they're so old. I send my leaky pen to work on good books without skiving. I serve men of greater worth, my wrists stiff from writing. And some of these poems are cheeky. I'll find a cheeky one for you. But you said this to me before as well, that the writers are cheeky. What's
Yes.
your experience of this?
Well, I think it's quite it's a thing that comes through medieval, um, even works of art, and even in religious contexts like cathedrals, and there's always like cheeky things hiding, like gargoyles and things like that, where they have. Why you give me that
I'm
look?
not. I'm listening to you.
Because I don't know, it's quite common, like in art, to see things that don't fit within they're irreverent, or they're mundane in a context that should be religious. I don't know. It's quite a medieval thing, I think.
To play around with.
Yeah, to well, because at the end of the day, I think medieval times, it's all this literature about how life was so gloomy, and you know um, all this religious influence that dominated everything, but at the same time, there are very mundane things added to it, and I think that happens also in the text.
It's like Monty Python, very subversive.
A bit. I don't know. I think that's quite a well. I wouldn't say it's quite a medieval thing, but perhaps it is more obvious because everything else is so austere and dramatic and transcendent.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you said the word transcendent. It's like we always have these pageants and these rituals that speak to a higher thing, but maybe no human being has ever felt it truly, in the sense of you have these rituals or these edifices, these churches with these ideas, and the idea is important for society or for believing in a higher thing. It's good for the soul, but most of the time, if you're a human being, you're not thinking of a higher truth. You're just taking the piss, basically. So I think it probably speaks to the fact that there's a disconnect between the things that we aspire to and how we live our lives as well, which is true now and also true of people at different points in history, maybe.
Yeah, I think that that could be the case. In the case of the cathedral, like we're talking about workers and masons and things like that. And also, like, in this case, well, I don't know, while you were reading about the scribe, I was just thinking that it must be. I mean, these people spend like ages and ages, just hours, all their lives, just writing manuscripts, just
Yeah.
translating. And so, well, if you think about it, it makes sense that every so often you would drop in a joke or like a fleeting thought that you're having, to make the task like more bearable.
Well, they're obviously serving a master, like the head of the monastery, God perhaps, but also because these manuscripts were so important for education. And in the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of the Irish manuscripts were important for keeping the old culture alive. But I guess as well, you have a sense of whatever the master is, whether it's the future or safeguarding knowledge or God or the abbot, you kind of lose yourself in that, which is what their service is. But they reclaim some of their identity and their sense of self, I think, through joking around. Also, as well, you have situations where Irish monks are maybe in other countries, like maybe France or Switzerland, and there's two things happening here. They can write things in the margins, in Irish, and then the Swiss abbot or whatever could ask what that is, and they go, "Oh, it's just what it says in Latin, but in Irish," and it's kind of a joke there as well. But also, if you're an Irish monk going to that monastery, afterwards, or while that monk who wrote the thing in the margin was still there, he's gone, he's left from home, and he sees this poem in Irish in a language that's his, that he knows, and it could be a poem that he knows and it's like something familiar, or it could be a new poem where he learns something new about his own country. But it's a sense of home as well, on foreign shores. And a lot of the poems of people outside of Ireland, it's always about exile and not wanting to be there, and as we'll talk about as well, there's a cult of Colm Kill, who was a saint who got exiled as well. So and they wrote a lot of poems about him, and often put poems in his name as well. So I think the idea, like, we've always been a nation of people being forced to leave, or if we leave, we kind of like look back to Ireland, and like even that like little crumb of like a joke in the margin is, I think, as a trend, is human value as well. This is what the whole thing is, just putting a human face onto these devout monks who were human beings. And there's a great poem here as well in one of the pages, but how he wants God to give him strength because he's always thinking about partying and boozing and everything. And so again, it's very, very human and tallies with the lives of saints. Some saints were party boys before they became saints, or was it Thomas of Aquinas? I don't know. I think he was a bit of a rebel as well. I can't remember. My
Saint Augustine,
St. Augustine was, yeah, a bit of a lush.
maybe.
So what's that in the Saint? Our favorite movie's the Saint. Give me temperance and give me chastity, but do not give it yet. Words to live by,
Yeah.
but not die by. Quick confession on the bed, and then you're golden with God. Uh, now I don't. Now it's your turn to stop giving me a look. So yeah. So I think that a reference is very interesting. And speaking of this, this poem is 4 lines. And here it is in its entirety. There's a lady in these parts whose name I'm slow to divulge, but she's known to let off farts like stones from a catapult. Bravo. It's an amazing work of art. But then, literally 2 pages later, you have you seen Hugh, the Connacht king in the field? All that we saw was his shadow under his shield. Now, this there's no date attributed to this, but they do mention in the introduction that a lot of poems from the 6th to the 9th centuries were very restrained and full of love of nature. Now, the poems after that were also full of a love of nature, but the editor says they're more uneven and they don't have the same restraint that you see in these earlier poems. I think this is a good poem as well because you do see in 4 lines, I think there's a wealth of feeling and implication in those 4 lines and what it means for the people involved in this battle as well. So I think it's a nice little poem. So before I continue talking, the irreverence, the titles, is there anything else that you found interesting?
um,
Well, for example, the translation element of it, it seems very tricky because, as I was mentioning to you off air as well, you had a mixture, like after, I mean, with the monasteries, they were safeguarding knowledge, but there weren't any universities in Ireland, and a lot of these things survived either partially in good condition or maybe not so good condition. So you had a mixture as well of oral tradition and the written text, and there wasn't like a clear division between those. So you had these things mixing together for a very long time, and each time you tell a story, it kind of grows legs or adds a little element to it. So that's obviously, which you probably already know as a translator, these kind of things about translating from the past. Now, also as well, things that are missing, sometimes the writer fills in things into the poem, how they think the poem should read or how it should be finished, for example. Are you familiar with other examples of this in the history of translation?
well, I think maybe it's more of a recent thing to try and keep uh, poems in their original way. But for example, probably in the 19th century, it was quite a common thing to um, kind of interpret what those traditions or what those feelings would have been and adapt them to the society and values of that moment. So I think that happens a lot in history and well, from a historical point of view, I suppose that's also important you know to to um, to see how like history is rewritten and how literature is modified. But obviously, when we have the original text and we have the ability to keep it as close to what it would have been originally, then I think that's a lot better. Even if the other attempts have value, but you know, I think the closest you can keep it to the original, the more relevant.
Okay. And also other things about the poem, poems from the Irish tradition. They mentioned that there's a huge sea saga where people would stay with the other worlds and meet kind of creatures, and that kind of division between the real and the myth is kind of very present in this type of poetry as well, because they mentioned Colm Kill, and for 200 years or so they used to attribute poems to him, and he say he was the writer. So this idea that life and history is like it was a coming together of the real and the unreal, or the imagined, and this kind of boundary between the mythological and historical forces is kind of very weak, for example. So the other world is very present in these as well. Now, one of the most startling things, and I know you were very impressed by this as well, was that the Irish monks separated the words. So in Latin, a lot of the words were kind of just a continuous line of words, but in the Irish poetry, they separated the words, which had a tremendous effect because words took on new meaning and new power with stresses and intonation and everything. And this is a feature of the poem as well, where like Irish poetry has a very musical quality. Now, we've spoken about this before in a podcast about the BBC and article about saving dead languages and writing poetry in dead languages, and that was one of the markers of Irish poetry, was that it was very musical, while other kind of like dead languages or dying languages would have certain characteristics, like it comes from a mountainous region, so it's influenced by mountains, or they wouldn't have a word for blue, for example. So our kind of characteristic is the musicality of it all. So I mean, it's almost as seismic as inventing zero, no? our understanding of poetry in terms of metric and meter and stanzas and rhyme and the power of words, what word should be there, what should be substituted, what other word could replace it, is all based on this idea that the Irish were the first to separate those words, for example. So it is a huge moment in writing poetry. Well, philosophically, maybe I don't know. If someone's speaking, I can see why maybe people think it's a chain of words, where there's no natural break. Um, and also I can see how people would imagine words written down would have these natural spaces, for example. But yeah, a lot very flexible. So the last thing we'll say about these, if you want poetry about love, about being a monk, about nature, about very human things, and also fantastical things, and references to Norse men coming across the waves to catch you and kill you. Or as one Seamusini translation puts it, I feel good tonight. There are no Norsemen coming across the waves to catch me. That's a very loose remembrance of what he actually said, but it's something along those lines. But
Yeah.
he puts it a lot more poetically than I did. So, well, that's everything I think about this book. You can probably get this on Amazon, or if you're in an English-speaking country, probably Ireland or even in the United Kingdom, it should be very easy to pick this little bad boy up. So, anything else to add?
No, I don't think so. I think well, it's a compilation. It's not. I think in a way it's quite nice that it's not divided by any sort of subject or anything like that, subject criteria or anything. So I think I quite like the fact that you have something very deep, and then in the next page you find something quite irreverent or well, I think it's interesting because well, it keeps your attention, and then it's also a portrayal of how these two things were intertwined, and you find like frivolous things on like very sacred texts. So it probably mirrors more reality.
Okay, so two final things to say. This is not a paid endorsement, and you want to hear
Mm.
more poems involving ladies farting. Wow, that was amazing. Was it as good for you as it was good for me?
Better even.
Really?
Yes.
Wow, interesting. So, thank you for tuning in to this podcast. Find us on alarpamedia.com, alarpa1 on Twitter, and our YouTube channel. And you can stop giving me that look now. And we'll be back next week with another podcast, which will be recorded on Monday and uploaded sometime next week. And then the following 2 weeks, I'll be doing the podcast solo. So hopefully you won't miss the dulcet tones of Mary here. Can you give us an example of what we're going to be missing? Can you say something?
Oh, wow, you're gonna be missing?
Like, yeah, say something in your voice. Wow, I
Um,
will miss that. That was sweet.
Wonderful stories.
That was musical.
Deep thoughts.
I would listen to you read the phone book and do the shipping forecast. And I'm sure I'm not alone. Our legions of listeners are also enchanted by that soft Leonesa accent. But when she's angry, she does roar. Not a nice thing to hear. Okay, well, this is me signing off, saying bye-bye for one more week. And, of course, you, the lioness, the mighty, the untamed Mary, going...
Bye.
Rawr. The Alarpa Podcast, the home for cultural chit-chat in and outside Madrid. People will talk.